Hello, my name is Tamara Warren, and I am the CEO and founder of LaCar, and so happy today to have this conversation on behalf of the Women Automotive Network Leadership Group. And the subject that we're talking to today is someone who's got a lot to offer in her field, and that is Sarah Berhalter with BCG. She is a partner there, the Boston Consulting Group. Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with me today.
Of course, Tamara, and thanks so much for having me.
Great. So without further ado, let's jump in and talk about how the Boston Consulting Group is involved and in the transportation industry. If you could share a bit about your work, that would be fantastic.
No, absolutely. Happy to. So as you said, I'm a partner out of our Atlanta office here at BCG, but BCG is a global consulting company and across a wide range of topics, but one of the areas that we specialize in is auto and mobility. So you'll see, we've got over 800 members dedicated across the world, just specifically to auto. We've got a wide range of clients and projects across the globe. And are kind of known for not only being able to support the auto industry, but broader mobility and where that space is going in the coming years.
And where is it all going, Sarah? Tell me, because it's very confusing from where I'm sitting. There's so much happening in this space and so many challenges that are in the present day and ahead. How do we think about those changes?
No, it's an exciting time. I mean, it really is. COVID aside, which I'm sure we'll speak to, because I think as we talk through these, there's been a lot of changes just from that. But I'd say even before that, you're seeing a lot of trends, both just in terms of, where people are living, how they're engaging with mobility. So, I think as we look in the coming years, you'll see more people in kind of urban settings. I don't think you can have a conversation on auto and mobility without talking about the impact of electrification, sustainability, and how companies are really thinking about that. And I think that's not only in terms of like hybrids and cars and how you're looking at it, but also the technology inside. And I think that's opened a whole new world for new entrants. You've got some of these smaller companies coming up. We saw it a lot early in terms of how people got access to their vehicles, but you're seeing it more and more on the technology inside the car and what that represents as well. And then I think the other one that I think I'm personally kind of very involved with and finding very exciting is the role of the ecosystem now. Where before you kind of were able to operate and have your scale and work through. But with these new entrants, with these new technologies, it's really interesting to see how these are coming together and how those big incumbents are kind of taking what they have to offer. I think that dealer network, the scale, the reach, the name, and starting to build these really neat partnerships with some of these new incumbents coming in and these new entrants. And that role of the ecosystem, I think, is going to be increasingly coming to play in the coming years.
Super interesting. Could you break down a little bit more about the incumbents? Like, who are these players? What do we need to know about them? And how should we think about them as our industry shifts?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly, speaking specific to the auto space, not broader mobility. I mean, you've got the big auto players, the names that you have in kind of all of the houses, the household names. And as you look on the street, you know what a lot of those players are. I think what you're starting to see is, those historically had kind of the scale, the supply chain, the infrastructure, and their dealer network that went out. And I think what you're starting to see increasingly is you're starting to get some partnerships and some collaborations with the smaller players in order to, for them to build that capability, to build that technology and grow. And then also to give those smaller companies that are just starting up that platform kind of through those networks, through those dealerships and kind of everything that they have to offer there.
So we're talking about the OEMs, the car companies,
exactly,
supplier networks, and the dealer level.
Exactly.
All the tiers of the auto industry. Interesting. And now when we think about some of the trends there, I mean, maybe we could dig a little bit more into some of the things that you mentioned. You talked about particularly, electrification and autonomy and mobility in terms of COVID. How do you keep up with these trends? How do you gather this information and take stock of it?
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting too, because I think particularly, this was already starting to happen, right? As the consumer was getting more and more confident online. But I think COVID accelerated that. I think the biggest thing, with most people now starting their journey for auto online, you still would see a lot going into dealerships, test driving the car, really making sure that they kind of get there and physically kind of inspect the vehicle. And that was a trust element. And I think what you've seen with COVID and with some of the recent kind of trends, and honestly, it was a forcing function with a lot of people having to stay home, is increasing trust of what you can get online, and kind of increasing confidence in what that looks like. And so I think what you're starting to see is those companies who are able to provide that confidence and provide that trust, and are also able to kind of blend the online and the offline, so the omni-channel components of this, are really the ones that are starting to see kind of that headway in terms of keeping up with these trends. And I think, more broadly, right, if you're a company in this space and you're really looking through, I think there are so many different areas to look at and where to go, like focus, right? What are the specific areas that benefit kind of you and where you're going? Focus is going to be key. And I think also kind of being willing to let go of some of the status quo and what you've done for years and years. So you have the benefit of scale, you have the benefit of the brand, right? But how do we challenge that, and how do we kind of build the opportunity to grow and to reach the consumers where they are now? And so, to do that, there's a lot of kind of infrastructure elements and challenges, which I'm sure you'll ask about. But in order to do that, it's, investing in data, investing in being able to reach your consumer where they are. And I think more than anything, everyone's so indexed on the digital component of this, but at the end of the day, it comes down to your people, right? So investing in the talent and making sure that you've got kind of the right resources and the right capabilities in-house as well are just as important. You can have all the data and the infrastructure in the world, but if you don't have the people who understand and support it, you don't kind of win that talent war. Ultimately, you're probably not going to see it all the way through.
100% right. And it's so interesting to think that, there is this critical inflection point in the industry happening, perhaps accelerated because of COVID, maybe wouldn't have happened despite COVID, but it seems like the dust is still settling. And, now we're in this new space where the challenges that were present 3 years ago are very different from the challenges today. And so very quickly as an industry, there's been, a rush to understand what are the new challenges, because I can think as a reporter working for 5 years ago, what we anticipated were the challenges were not the supply chain and supply of chips. It was more on a consumer acceptance of electrification, autonomy, and even digital retailing, right? But here we are in 2021 going into 2022 and beyond, and we have to think about what that means going forward. So what do you see as the critical challenges that you're most focused on?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, it is interesting to your point. Like, I think COVID introduced opportunity, but also those challenges. So when you think about the supply chain or the supply constraints, and I think what businesses really need to be focusing on right now is what of those are short term, right? Kind of immediate for this, and then what are the ones that are going to last and are going to stay. But I think, most would agree, regardless, to come up with these changes and to meet those consumers where they are, it's capital intensive. Right. And that's where I'm saying some of these incumbents do have the advantage over those smaller players. And that's where those partnerships can really have an advantage, because the infrastructure may not be aligned to those new tech needs, but they've got some of the capital, they've got the willingness to invest. And then to your point, it's not just about kind of supply constraints, which is a reality right now. I absolutely believe that, but the world, I think, will catch up, right? I think what we're going to find is as we go forward with this, the supply chains themselves are going to be increasingly complex. And so, from different locations, different technologies, different partners and groups. And I think managing that complexity across the supply chain is going to be something that a lot of these players, OEM or small players, are going to have to be managing. And I think that's going to last well beyond the times of COVID.
And as you mentioned, infrastructure, which is also tied to so many other elements of, regulatory issues that vary from continent to continent, to country to country, to state to state, to city to city. Navigating those changes is, as you mentioned, very complicated. But then also thinking about when we think about these challenges going forward, the auto industry has not been known for being the most the speediest in actually implementing changes. So, and the capital that exists along these lines is so critical to make this happen quickly. Do you see the industry changing the way it does business in order to rise to the challenge, or do you see signs of that happening in this short time period we've lived in the last 18, 24 months?
No, you really do. And I think, it's challenging, but it's really an exciting time for the industry. And I think you're seeing kind of an increasing like willingness to go there, right? And you're also seeing an increasing, I think, belief in some of these bigger players that this is happening and that it's here. So yes, I mean, I agree that there's a lot to do and it can be a bit daunting, but it really is an exciting time. And you are seeing a lot of the industry really step up and embrace it. So it'll be great to see where this is five years from now.
Yeah. And in order to get that to that 5-year mark, what are the biggest changes that need to happen most immediately? And what are more of the long-term changes that we're working toward?
Yeah. So I think probably the biggest short-term piece is going to be like clarify the goal, right? I think everyone's been kind of reacting and kind of in reaction mode with COVID and with some of these changes. So it's like, okay, how do we sit down? How do we really focus? And where do we want to be in 3-5 years? So I think that's going to be a key piece here now that the dust is settling a little bit. I think the other piece is going to be invest now in the data that you need for the future. And what you see a lot of is, companies investing to get data caught up to where they need to be today. And by the time that happens, they're behind again. So it's really thinking ahead and saying, how do I invest now in what I need 3-5 years from now, instead of just catching up, particularly for some of these industries. And autos, this is not exclusive to auto, right? But some of these broader industries that weren't as tech focused or as data heavy up until this point.
Could you give an example of a key piece of data that one might look for in this space? Like, data is such a vast topic, right? Like, what area would be one example?
Yeah, I think, just playing back kind of consumer expectations in the space, the ability to have your data cross channels. And I think particularly for us, right? To be able to go from you have an engagement with the OEM, and then you can walk down the street into a dealership. And I think from a customer perspective, they don't differentiate that, oh, well, the dealer's, doesn't have that information, or you don't know, I was online. They see it as your company. Mm-hmm. And so I think particularly in this space, the ability for your data to cross that line to truly be omni-channel. So it's a cohesive experience for your customer, whether they engage with you online, on their app, in the store, at the dealership, that all of that kind of gets captured into a unified profile. I think is something that'll be particularly key, especially, as I spoke to, when these other partnerships come in and there's other elements that you can engage. Yeah. I think being able to link those across all those channels will be particularly key.
Right, which is a challenge when stores are owned by so many different entities that are competing against the store down the street, right? So lots to sort out there. But then when we look at high level pulling back, how, when we think about a lot of these changes, some is top down in organizations, obviously, and you mentioned talent early on in our conversation, and thinking about talent that is top talent, but part of that piece of being top talent is having a diversified workforce that represents the consumers you want to reach, right? So what do you have any particular strategies or advice for organizations as they are looking to think about what diversity, equity, inclusion strategies actually mean in the short term and long term?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to this. And I think, there's no doubt that the data shows all day long, right, that a diverse company is successful, more resilient. You get kind of more mindsets and views in. So I think increasingly you're not getting challenged on the importance of it. I think it's really about now the execution and what it looks like and how it happens. And I look at it in two ways. I think one is, how do you embed it in the day-to-day? right? It's not one town hall meeting for an hour and it's done. It's really about putting in the processes and the systems to have it in the day-to-day to where everyone feels like their voice matters regardless of where it's coming from, and that the leaders are given the tools to make space for those conversations. And I think that's one element of it. I think the other is, and I think it's particularly relevant for, you know, a consulting firm, but you'll see it in auto and the other industries as well, is that making sure that who you partner with and who you practice also, you know, represent it. Because I think if you're saying one thing in-house, but then you're going and serving and partnering with someone who doesn't represent what you stand for in that area, it doesn't hit home for kind of your employees, your talents, and your team. So, you know, embedded in-house, it's not a one meeting, it's not a, hey, we had our luncheon on it, right? It's in your day-to-day, but it's also in the partners that you keep and making sure that they kind of adhere to the same views on diversity and inclusion that you do.
Mm-hmm. And how can we start to standardize evaluation of those partners where there's actually the, you know, it takes courage to change, right? Especially if these are longstanding partnerships or that maybe don't serve the overall messaging. What, you know, is there this particular strategy or way of evaluating that? Like, how does that get to the decision maker levels in order to implement that change?
Yeah, I think that's going to vary group to group. I think at the core of it, though, is going to be being willing to ask the hard questions and being willing to stand your ground, right? Knowing where your line is as a company, knowing where your line is as a team, and not compromising on that. And I think, you know, if you're being pressured or you're feeling like you need to compromise, like don't make assumptions, ask the hard question, but then know, okay, if we're at this point, like I'm willing, where am I willing to walk away? And that comes at the leadership level. And I think, you know, having your leaders be aware of that line, having your leaders know that that line will be supported by the company, and then also having your leaders communicate it down. So if, you know, your teams are feeling any kind of pressure or challenge, that they're willing to raise it because they know they'll be supported by their boss, who knows they'll be supported by their company.
Yeah, and that's one other area of change that's so essential to achieving all the rest of these changes we've discussed.
Of course.
And then when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion, one piece of that is gender, and thinking about women in particular in the industry and what that means going forward. Do you feel that there is an opportunity for women currently in automotive?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I know, you know, historically, and you still hear it, it's a male dominated space. And I'm not going to say that it's not, but I do think increasingly you're seeing not only some women be incredibly successful. I mean, look at the conference, look at all of kind of the conversations that we've been having. I think it's at the forefront of a lot of minds and a lot of conversations. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and space there. You know, so from the challenges that we've had in the past and from kind of the groundbreakers that we've had, it's introduced a whole world of opportunity for women who are interested in getting into the space.
Mm-hmm. And so do you have one word that would sum up that opportunity?
I'd say exciting. Exciting would be my word for it.
Yeah, that's a great,
good time to be in the industry.
Yeah, and that's just a positive, great note to end on. Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time out to have this conversation today, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Of course. No, thanks so much for making the time.